So we're going to talk about values and ethics a little bit in this lecture. I like to start this off with the quote, and I think I have a couple more quotes from Aldo Leopold throughout the lecture, but one of the things that he said was that there were two spiritual dangers in not owning a farm. One is the danger that that people will think breakfast comes from the grocery, and the other that heat comes from the furnace. And I think this is a pretty cool quote. And basically, what he was talking about is that as human populations continue to grow and we become more and more disconnected from where our food comes from and energy and all those sorts of things, we start to lose appreciation for all of these things in nature, and people start to lose values and ethics associated with it. Uh, One of the things that we talk about in wildlife when we're doing these wildlife studies, and we have individuals in the study, maybe you put a radio tag on a tortoise or a deer or whatever, and one of the things we always talk about is don't name them, right? That takes it to another level of personal connection with the animal, and you immediately start to care more for it. And I think that's what Aldo was trying to get at. This is a quote from his book. So when you get to that, really contemplate what he's talking about. I think it's a pretty interesting, uh, thought-provoking conversation that he's having in the book. So in terms of values of wildlife, there are many different kinds. So we're going to talk about all of these that I have listed here, and I'm going to just briefly go over what each of these really mean. So obviously, wildlife can have a commercial value. This was particularly important, in the history of our model, and particularly with market hunting. And you should be far enough now in the material to realize that market hunting created a lot of problems, and we actually have had several acts of legislation that are preventing market hunting. So we still do have some uh, economic models like trapping, fur trapping, for instance. That's still pretty common. It's not nearly as common as it was 100 years ago in terms of per capita for trappers, but that is still widely practiced today. And another thing, you've probably gotten far enough along now to know that we do have some funding that comes by way of excise taxes on sporting goods or fishing goods. We're going to talk about that a little more later in it. But another thing that is becoming very common now is for people to pay to access private lands. So you may have a lease where you lease the rights on private lands, or it's pretty common in this state on quail plantations for people to pay a fee to go and hunt quail for a day. So that's a really common way that people make money off of wildlife. So another one would be recreational value. Most of you probably enjoy this value of wildlife or have a strong recreational value. How many of you try to experience nature when you're going on vacation, or just to improve your own mental well-being? There's been some really cool studies showing that people walking a certain amount each week, and comparing groups that were walking only in cities versus ones that were walking the same amount in nature, and it causes this cascade of different physiological changes, and can affect human health, basically, not just mental health, but actually your physiological health, which is pretty cool. We are very much in tuned with nature, and a lot of things in our body function really well when nature is involved. So if you're really interested in that kind of thing, there's some really cool stuff on biophilic design. Go check that out. You'll One thing that you might immediately realize if you go through biophilic design, or at least Google what that means, you'll realize that the UF campus is actually relatively well designed in terms of biophilic design. So really cool line of literature, and we'll probably talk about it some more in this class later in lectures. So there's also obviously biological value. So we keep coming back to this idea of diversity, and when you have diverse communities, we have stability, and those diverse communities that are stable provide a number of ecosystem services like pollination services, seed dispersal, nutrient cycling, nutrient transport, all sorts of services uh, that are positively influenced by diversity in systems. So another quote that I thought was a pretty good fit for what we're talking about now from Aldo Leopold was this one, where he's talking about essentially, civilization, humans, we're in this interdependent cooperation with all these other animals and plants and all these functions and ecosystems, and that's a really fragile thing, and if you disrupt any part of any of those things, then the system is likely to fail, and we've seen that in some contexts where systems completely move to an alternative stable state. And he was really talking about the ethics and how ethics, an ethical person has to really make these kinds of decisions, because what is ethical may not necessarily be what is illegal. Those don't always translate exactly the same, and when he's talking about ethics, he's really focusing in on that. So they also have a scientific benefit from educational. Obviously, we're talking about it right now in the classroom. So educating people, there's real value in that. And from a scientific standpoint, we learn a lot about ourselves and human health even from studying animals, right? We get a lot of value from that. We understand how systems function. That allows us to better understand how we can cooperate in that way that Aldo was talking about. If we understand how the system functions better, we can better serve as stewards of that function so that it doesn't collapse. So there's real value for wildlife in that from that standpoint. Uh, Also, they're aesthetically pleasing. We talked about this a little bit. I actually go out on a walk every day on campus, and I visit several of the natural areas. And for me, I realize that it's on campus and it's surrounded by development from other activities on campus, but I still get a lot of value aesthetically from walking around in those natural areas and hearing the birds singing and seeing flowers and fruits and those sorts of things. So there's definitely a strong importance, and probably for people in this classroom a particularly strong importance, but also native peoples from around the world really value the resources that are indigenous to where they are, and that cultural importance has a real strong value overall. uh, that kind of lends itself to these social wildlife values. And one thing I want you to realize is these things aren't mutually exclusive necessarily. So social values, that'd be anything that has a positive effect on the community, human communities as a whole. So you can think about a bunch of things, but they're not a social wildlife value is not necessarily mutually exclusive from an aesthetic value or a scientific value, and so forth. So when we were talking about ecosystem services, for instance, that has real value. There are people whose job is to quantify the value of those ecosystem services to society. They do have a real value. So another thing is we don't know everything. We know that there's real value in wildlife and plants, and we have learned just tremendous amounts from these species, and we are, there are people who study this all the time who are trying to synthesize chemicals from plants, or for health purposes, for medicines. You may not realize that a large portion of our chemical arsenal were actually originally found in a plant, or in some cases other organisms. Uh, Something else you might not realize, one of the really cool things that I think are cool about deer is they grow antlers. So they basically are growing this new tissue each year. It hardens into bone and then it casts off, and then they do the same thing next year. That's the closest thing in a mammal to limb regeneration, and that's pretty important. And there are people who are studying how antlers form and grow to try to understand from a human health standpoint how we might be able to utilize that information. So there's a lot of value in wildlife and other organisms that uh, you see me, even I'm thinking of wildlife as vertebrates. I shouldn't be saying that. You should already know that based on some of the other material I've looked at. Just wildlife. So all organisms in general have value, and we don't even know what we don't know. So they have intrinsic value just for that purpose. They also can have negative values, and one that I've dealt with pretty commonly, actually two that I've dealt with pretty commonly are in this picture. One, beavers commonly become an issue for timber production landowners. So if their primary goal is to grow trees and sell those trees, beaver can become a big problem for that. Deer also may be a problem for affecting regeneration, but uh, they pretty typically are a really big problem and issue that state and federal agencies are dealing with because of human safety and the cost to insurance claims and everything that happen with hitting wildlife. So if you go up and down I-10, that is such a big problem that we actually have high fences along the roadways on either side to try to keep wildlife from crossing the road because it's such a big problem. So obviously predators eating uh, agricultural animals could be a big problem as well. So that brings me to the economics. We talked about a few minutes ago the value that comes from wildlife economically from hunting and fishing. And I just wanted to put some numbers on that for you. By now, after you've gone through some of the material I've given you, you should realize that there are some financial pillars of our field. And one of those is coming from hunting license sales. So try to think about what that is for a minute. What legislation is giving that excise tax on hunting goods and from hunting license sales. Two, from fishing, that we have a similar act or a similar legislation that does the same thing on fishing goods. And notice I have wildlife watchers on here. They buy a lot of the same kinds of goods. So think about like binoculars. If you watch birds, you probably have a nice pair of binoculars. Those kinds of items have a tax on them that go back in. But if you've watched the other stuff, you'll realize that hunters and fishers have been really important because they are financial pillars. They're really, putting up, or at least historically, we're putting up the majority of money that was going back into the conservation of these species, and that's pretty important. So hopefully you've thought about what those two pieces of legislation are, but if you have not, I'll let you know the excise tax on the hunting goods came from the Pittman-Robertson Act, and the excise tax on the fishing goods came from the Dingell-Johnson Act. So make sure you know those. Those definitely will show up the on the exam. But look how much money is being spent. This is just in Florida every year, and this is fairly outdated. Notice this resource was from 2012, and that was over the past few years before that. It's grown substantially even since then. But already you can see how much money hunters put into that fund, which ultimately gets reallotted back to the state agency to manage wildlife resources, and that's a tremendous amount of money that's going into it. So we have 250,000 hunters probably today, and they're spending over $3,000 a piece per year just on hunting. Now, a lot of those people might be the same people who are contributing the fishing funds, but they don't always overlap perfectly. But you can see fishing in this state, they don't provide as much per person, but it is an unbelievable amount of money when you think about there are 3 million people fishing in this state every year. It's a tremendous amount of money. So same thing with wildlife watchers. They may be some of the same people here, but people buying these goods and paying for a permit to go on some of the public lands that require it, even when you're not hunting. They're contributing a tremendous amount of money, and you are if you're doing these activities and paying for it. So these have been really important. If you look at the U.S., it's the same thing. I mean, look at $130 billion in 2011. I suspect that's probably closer to 150 billion now. So, but again, this is from this published resource. I wanted it to be based on science. If you look at all these different ways that funding come in, we have 12.5 million hunters just from license sales, 725 million. So this PR, that's Pittman Robertson, you can see how much money is coming in based on all these funding mechanisms. It's been pretty incredible. A lot of it is from the excise taxes that are on retail items like binoculars or bullets or fishing lures, those sorts of things. They all have that tax on them. So non-consumptive uses are becoming particularly important now, and you can see from a ways back there was an estimate of 4 million just on this one wildlife refuge. So people trying to engage in the outdoors are now contributing a lot of money into just the economy in general, and a lot of it comes back to conservation. So there's also problems with that, right? If we are constantly using parks or other natural areas, we're also having a human impact. And there's been a lot of research that I follow fairly closely that you can look up, kind of debating whether conservation is being affected negatively or positively by ecotourism. And you probably hear some of these. The same, there are different versions of this argument. Sometimes it's talking about hunting, other times ecotourism, but essentially, all these people engaging in resources is diminishing the value of those resources or the wildness of that. And Aldo talks about this quite a bit in one of the writings that he has, where he's talking about us using the resources actually diminishing the value of it. So wildlife viewing, you'll notice I didn't mention bird watchers contribute a huge amount. I was trying to figure out exactly where is all the money from bird watching coming from, and quite a bit of it's coming from feed. I think I have it on one of the next few slides talking about how much people pay for birdseed, but it's a pretty incredible amount. But you're going to see that these non-consumptive uses, they may be negative in some contexts because of us infringing on nature, but also they're pretty important. A lot of people don't think about, we wouldn't have a lot of the natural lands if we didn't have these funds to purchase them, or we didn't have funds to manage them or protect them. So there's obviously a trade-off between these things, but I think I would argue that it's a net in the good. Even though we're infringing on nature, we have so much funding that's coming from those activities to put back into conservation that that's a pretty good thing. Not to mention that people literally are healthier because of having those opportunities to engage in it. I don't want to go through in detail all of these numbers, but I just wanted to give you some really good ideas of the different kinds of monetary ways that we get money from wildlife. So they're hunting again, this is big time business. Look at some of these animals. People are paying $10,000 or $11,000 for it to have an opportunity to to harvest one of these animals. Again, some of these might actually increase substantially depending on where you are and how uh, good the resource is. I mean, good like if you have trophy class animals, they may be much more valuable in one area than another. Generally, in Florida, for instance, a white-tailed deer is not extremely valuable if you compare it to Texas or Iowa or something like that, where they have a reputation for producing really large antlered deer. But I just thought it'd be interesting for you to see the enormous amount of money that people pay for some of these animals. There are some places for northern bobwhite where people are paying more like $1,000 per bobwhite, and just think about that. It's such a little piece of meat and that you get from that thing. I mean, it's tasty. Don't get me wrong, and that's a fun experience. But man, it's so expensive. It's amazing to me that people are willing to pay some of these amounts. So there's also the hunting leases become really common, and in this part of the world, a lot of times the value of per acre from wildlife, especially if you're leasing it to hunting for quail or deer or waterfowl, those in particular, they can actually generate more money per acre than growing livestock on it, which is pretty incredible. A lot of people are actually have both sources of income on land, but leases are pretty common here. They're somewhere in this neighborhood, generally $5 to $25 per acre, but in other states that can be substantially more. I worked in the Mississippi River alluvial valley, right in the flyway for waterfowl, and the people are paying just thousands of dollars per acre in some cases to be able to hunt a waterhole. So they'd be paying for an individual pond that they would have access to for the hunting season, and they may, for just 10 or 12 acres, might actually pay $10,000 or $15,000 for that year to have access to it. So pretty incredible thinking about how much money goes into this industry every year. And thankfully, a lot of that goes back into conserving these species. Here's some more numbers. Just look at how much some of these, the value of some of these things. This is on private ranches in Florida. Yeah, so hunting has been, that the pillar of our development in this country, and one of the reasons that we have so many jobs and it has been such a sustainable industry is because of those Pittman Robertson funds that come in, and we have such a strong culture, especially in the southeastern United States, for hunting. I mean, think about, the people that were coming here from Europe. That's a completely different model from what it is here. So there, basically the nobles owned land and they had access to wildlife, but most people did not. Unless you were really wealthy, you didn't have access to it. And then people came here, and it was, wildlife seemed like a non-exhaustible resource, and we founded, sort of built this model that the resource belongs to the people. And that's been really important, and it's really unique to North America. So the one that you normally probably hear about when you're talking about hunting and whether or not it's a good or a bad thing is with sport hunting, and I hear about the argument from uh, people talking about African conservation with some of those animals, because there have been some really big instances that made the news where you probably have heard about it, about a particular individual being harvested or something. And this is definitely very controversial, but the other side of that argument is, well, there's so much money going into that opportunity that could be used for conservation. There could be some real value as well. If we have an individual rhino that's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, that could potentially be really impactful. Where the scrutiny comes in is whether or not that money is actually being used for that purpose or not, and that could be a discussion in and of itself, because I think there are probably goods and bads on that. But it's one of those things that is, you have to form your own opinion based on the information you have and your own set of values and ethics. But definitely one thing that's certain is there is a lot of value of those wildlife species for that purpose. Okay, we'll go ahead and cut it off there. I wanted to make this one fairly short, and I still went a little bit long, but just wanted to give you a general overview of the values of wildlife and different kinds there could be. Again, this is not going to be on the quiz on Tuesday, but it will be on the exam, so make sure to take notes and think about it when you're preparing for the exam. Talk to you later.